Hey guys, BuildZoid here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the much requested Asrock ITX AM4 motherboard. Huge thanks to the guy who sent the pictures in, because without him we wouldn't be taking a look at this board right now. So this is the AB350 Gaming-ITX/AC. However, I'm 99% sure that the power componentry on this board matches what is on the X370 ITX board from Asrock completely, like 100%. They're going to be identical if you take off the heat sinks. So with that kind of out of the way, let's get right into it. Now, actually, before we get right into it, well, this is technically part of it, so whatever. Since I don't have the motherboard in hand, I can't tell you if it's actually adequately cooled or not, because though I can tell you how much power the VRM will output for a certain amount of, current going through it, I cannot tell you if the heatsink sitting on top of the VRM is capable of dissipating that, and there's no real way I can get around that without having a motherboard in hand to test, because I don't know how much thermal pad there is. I don't know how conductive that thermal pad is. I don't know how much surface area the heatsink has, or like how well that heatsink interacts with airflow. So basically, there's no way to calculate how a heatsink will behave from like photos or anything. So I will give you I will tell you how much power the motherboard will put out in terms of like the VRM components. I will not be able to tell you if they're adequately cooled. So, with that out of the way, let's get right into it, starting with the most important VRM on the board, the Vcore VRM. Unfortunately, this may look like a 6-phase. It is not a 6-phase, and the reason for that is rather simple. This chip right here, which controls the Vcore VRM, is a Intersil ISL 95712, and this is a 4+2 phase voltage controller, so, it can't do 6 phases. And here it's actually running in 3-phase mode, and unfortunately the motherboard doesn't make use of any doublers, so really this 6-phase, in terms of actual in-phasedness, is basically that. Basically these two Mosfets right here will turn on at the same time and turn off at the same time. Same goes for these two, and same goes for these two. So for all intents and purposes, this is a 3-phase VRM. That basically means it does have some disadvantages compared to like a 4-phase or a 5-phase or a 6-phase design in terms of voltage regulation. How much of an impact this will have on overclocking, I have no idea. In theory, it should be, quite a lot worse than a 4-phase, depending also on switching frequency and the selection of capacitors on the motherboard and a bunch of other variables. So I can't tell you if this is going to be a major downside compared to a, like a 4-phase VRM or a, a higher phase count VRM from some other manufacturer. So the only way to figure that out is to actually test the board. But, I'm not a fan of big, like this kind of big 3-phase thing. It does help in terms of power dissipation, but it doesn't, it definitely gives you more VRM power capability. It just doesn't make the VRM run any, smoother, so to speak. So, yeah, and the reason why the board doesn't make use of any doublers is because the ISL 95712 integrates actually two of the gate drive circuits. Actually, I think 3. I need to check the datasheet. Give me a second. Where is my ISL datasheet? Okay, no, it integrates 3 of the gate drives. Okay, so it integrates, like, these two first phases are driven by the ISL 95712, and then this third phase has its own driver, which I think is this chip right there, but I'm not sure. The photos aren't good enough. But yeah, the ISL 95712 also runs at a typical operating frequency of 300 kilohertz. It can go a bit above that, but you generally won't do that because it'll just lower the VRM efficiency, and on a space-constrained board like that, you really don't want to have the VRM putting out any more heat than you already, than you absolutely need to. So yeah, I'm doing all the calculations for this at 300 kilohertz, and GIMP is being stupid. Great, I hate Windows and how it handles tablets sometimes. There we go, now it works. Lovely. Oh god, these videos are just so bad. Anyway, it does run at 300 it should run at 300 kilohertz switching frequency. And so let's get some power numbers for this VRM, depending on what kind of CPU you're running. For 8 cores, the Vcore VRM has to handle... This is really cool about Ryzen. It really doesn't pull that much power. For an 8-core Ryzen CPU, the VRM has to handle about 1.42 volts, 100 amps. Which it will, and will produce about 9 watts of heat in the process. So that's, again, 300 kilohertz, 1.42 volts, 100 amps. The VRM will put out 9 watts of heat. That's not a lot of heat, but then we'll get to my suspicion, like... I'm not 100, like, that's really not a lot of heat, but wait till you see the heat sinking that Asrock has given this board before you say, oh, it's going to be fine. Because I really don't like the heat sink. Then for a lower overclock, you know, so basically this 1.42, 100 amps, this would be like for a 4 gigahertz OC. If you're going for something lower, which the usual stopping point for a lot of people going for a sort of lower overclock is around 1.3 volts, but I'm going to go with the higher voltage just to compensate for the extra garbage CPUs that do occasionally pop up. 1.35 volts, 90 amps, you're looking at about 8 watts of heat dissipation, and that's going to be for a 3.8 gigahertz overclock on a 8-core CPU. So, you know, again, not a lot of heat, but wait till you see the heat sinks. For 6 cores, 1.42 volts, you're going to be looking at a power, and 4 gigahertz, you're going to look at a current draw of around 70 amps, which will produce about 5.2 watts of heat across the VRM. So a lot cooler than one of the 8 cores. This, I think the heatsink should be able to cool. I'm not 100%, like, not 100% guaranteed, but it should be able to deal with that. For a, you know, slower overclock of, say, 1.35 volts for 3.8 gigahertz again, then there you're going to be looking at about 65 amps to the CPU and about 4.4 watts of heat output. Yeah, there's not a big drop between, you know, the 1.42 volts to 1.35 volts, mostly because that's sort of like the current draw is heavily tied to the core count. Like, you can see that 70A and that's 100. So there's a big difference between having an 8-core and a 6-core, but there's not a big difference between frequency, and this already starts low, so it drops slower than the 8-core does. Now for a quad-core, I've only done the calculations for 1.42 volts because, quite frankly, the amount of power a quad-core pulls at 1.42 is so low that it doesn't make sense. Like, I can't believe that. No, I really have a hard time believing that even the stock heatsink wouldn't be able to do a 1.42 volts, 4 gigahertz overclock on a quad core. So 1.42 volts, you're going to be looking at about 50 amps, actually even below 50 amps, depending on your sample. And that's going to only produce about 3.7 watts of heat on the VRM. So, like nothing. So this, sure, you're definitely going to get away with this, I think. Well, if you add airflow to the heatsink, definitely. If you don't add airflow to the heatsink, who knows? Because here's the problem. Yeah. That is the VRM heatsink for the Vcore VRM. That is a lot of thermal pad, and I am not sure that it's very conductive. It certainly isn't as conductive as solid metal. So this right here is really concerning. This is just like, could you not measure it a bit better? Because it doesn't look like they should have clearance issues. If you look at the board, there's not really anything tall there. You have a few tiny little SMD capacitors, and then your good old low, you know, Mosfets are like, the package is like a millimeter, maybe 1.2 millimeter, I think, off of the top of my head. So why you need a massive thermal pad like this, I have no idea. And the next part, and the other issue is, this heatsink just is kind of, like, not a lot of heatsink. It really doesn't have a lot of surface area, does it? So, yeah. I'm not sure about this. Like, I'm really not sure about how well the VRM will run with that cooling. Now, I don't think... wrong layer. I really don't think that, like, a quad core with an overclock should be an issue, nor should a 6 core, but an 8 core with that 9 watts or 8 watts of VRM heat output, that might actually run into the limitations of that heatsink, if you can even call it that, because it's really not, it has no surface area. It barely makes any contact. Like, the contact is atrocious based on that thermal pad. It's rather concerning, to say the least. But without testing, you know, I can't say for sure that it's a problem. So, yeah. I'm worried, but no verdict right there. Worst case scenario, if you get the board, you're going to have to point a fan at the VRM. It might also be worth taking the VRM heatsink off and pointing a fan at the bare MOSFETs, because I have a suspicion that thermal pad could be doing more harm than good if you actually get active airflow onto the VRM. So, and by that I mean like taking a 40mm fan and like zip tying it right here. And I think a 40mm fan would be that big. I mean, this board is a 170mm, so yeah. That should just about work out with a 40mm fan zip tied out to the VRM. You should be pretty good. But yeah. That heatsink is not confidence-inspiring in the slightest. Let's move on to something that doesn't even have a heatsink, nor does it need it. The SOC VRM, which is located right here. It uses... Oh, I didn't even tell you what MOSFETs this uses. I don't know how I missed that. Okay, these and these. So the MOSFETs for both the Vcore and the SOC VRM. This being the SOC, so that's the system on a chip part of Ryzen, so that's the memory controller, PCIe, SATA, USB, all of that kind of logic, though the USB obviously actually outputs 5 volts and all that, but all the logic behind that is powered by this VRM there. So that's the SOC VRM, and the MOSFETs for all the, like, both Vcore and SOC are Fairchild Semiconductor FD PC5030 SG MOSFETs, dual NFETs, which is why you see one chip per inductor, except here where they've actually gone and put like two dual NFETs per phase, so you have like 2 low side MOSFETs, 2 high side MOSFETs in each phase, whereas here you have, well, for each inductor, whereas here you have 1 high side MOSFET and 1 low side MOSFET per inductor. Though really you have 2 inductors in each phase, so it's like 2 low sides, 2 high sides in per phase. But yeah, those are the MOSFETs it's using. So they're from Fairchild Semiconductor, and they're fairly high end, actually. Like, they're really not bad in terms of performance. So that's why the heat output is really, really low across the board for this VRM. The MOSFET selection is fine. It's just that heatsink is kind of questionable. Anyway, let's move on to the SOC VRM so that I don't keep dragging this video out any longer. The SOC VRM really doesn't need to do a lot of work. And generally, it should, like, 1.15 volts, 25 amps, which that is that I think is the maximum amount of current the SOC will ever pull, at least until we start seeing APUs with GPUs powered by the SOC VRM. It's only going to put out about 1.4 watts. I have no idea how much power an AMD APU GPU will pull, so that's why I don't have a number for it. But yeah, this on its own should actually be fine, because the package of these MOSFETs plus the inductor will dissipate a decent amount of heat. Plus this VRM is like it's not hotspotty at all, because it's pretty spread out. Like, it's almost the same. It has almost the same amount of surface area, if you consider it, right, as this right here. And and MOSFETs do sink a lot of the heat into the power planes that they're connected to, because those are just copper and they're soldered into those. So power planes do act as heat sinks. So these should be just fine without any heat sinking, because A, they don't need to push a lot of current, B, they are spread out. So that's why those are fine, and they don't put out a lot of heat to start with. Moving on to the final VRM that I can tell you anything about. This right here is the memory VRM, so that'd be like VDDR, and it only needs to power 2 sticks of memory. However, this right here is a fully integrated buck converter. So this is from Monolithic Power, and it is a, well, I think it's a MPQ 86, and I'm running out of space, MPQ 8636 fully integrated buck. The problem is I can't actually, like, it doesn't say that exactly on the actual FET itself. It just says that part. There's no Q. And I can't, also this thing comes in like 4 amp, 10 amp, and 20 amp flavors, which is an extension of the model number, which I can't get a match for this thing. I'm assuming Asrock did the smart thing and went with the 20 amp flavor, so I'm using the 20 amp flavor for all of the calculations here. So for memory, assuming that you're pushing 10 amps into the memory, which really that's a lot for DDR4. I don't think 2 sticks can actually pull that much. You'll end up with about 1 watt of heat dissipation on that MPQ 8636. If you're worried about that much watt coming off of an that much heat coming off of a unheat sinked chip like that, well, worry not, because this thing is rated to dissipate 3.3 watts all on its own in still air. So as long as you have some kind of airflow over the motherboard in that area, it should be doing just fine. Obviously, the minor issue with those zero airflow ratings from datasheets is they usually assume that the surrounding area of the chip is a solid piece of copper with nothing on it. So that doesn't really apply here, but still, it's 1 watt, and that package can do 3.3 watts in like optimum conditions. So really no issue there for I really don't see an issue with this here either. I mean, it is weaker than what you'd find on a lot of other Ryzen motherboards. Like, a lot of the ATX boards have just ridiculously overkill memory power, but this really is non-issue. Really, this should actually, this thing actually gets better efficiency at lower loads than a lot of the ridiculous overkill VRMs you see on full-size boards, because those ridiculous overkill VRMs basically end up spending a lot of power just turning on and off, whereas this is specifically optimized for extra low loads. So this actually probably has an efficiency win if you're not overvolting your RAM and running it really hard. So yeah, that's it for this breakdown. Overall, I'm I'm happy with the MOSFET selection that Asrock has made. I'm happy with the I don't have complaints about the MOSFET selection. It's just this heatsink, and that thermal pad, that is very, very concerning. I have a really hard time believing that actually works, because that is a lot of thermal pad, and that is not a lot of heatsink that it's connecting to. So that's concerning. But the actual hardware on the motherboard, it's a 3-phase. I really wish it was a 4. Admittedly, if they did a 4, they couldn't get this kind of power capability, because what you got to understand is, basically the trade-off here is if they go for 4 phases, they actually run 4 phases, they would need to basically, if they wanted to get a better power capability than what this has with its big 3-phase design, the only way to get a better power capability would be to use 33% more board space to do it. In fact, even more than that, because you'd need an extra driver chip, because you only have 2 integrated gate drives for your 4 phases. So they'd also need an extra driver chip. So they would end up increasing the amount of space that this VRM takes up a lot in order to maintain a certain, power level throughput. Whereas if they just went down to a cut down 4-phase, they would actually lose power capability over compared to the 6-phase, and that would actually increase heat output. And then, like, you know, so I think, like, power-wise, I'm happy with it. Voltage regulation-wise, I don't think it's going to be the best. But, you know, I think in the ITX form factor, power efficiency is probably the most important, because cooling is hard to come by, especially when you consider this a heatsink. But, yeah, so, you know, it has its trade-offs. It's an ITX board. These always have a trade-off unless they end up costing a ton of money, because manufacturers start getting creative with things like daughter-boarded VRMs, because you just can't fit that many components onto the board. So, you know, I don't have any, like, it is what it is, you know, it's an ITX board. You can't cram a full-size VRM on this. So I can't exactly fault it for trying to do its very best to at least keep the thermal output down while maintaining as many phases as is reasonably doable. The SOC VRM I have no complaints about. It's comparable to basically any other motherboard I've ever seen. Then the memory VRM, again, no complaints. DDR4 doesn't pull that much power. So overall, I'd say if you're buying this board, the only thing I'd keep an eye on is the VRM temperature, because that heatsink really doesn't look, you know, doesn't look confidence-inspiring. The VRMs themselves are fine. Oh, which reminds me, I forgot to go over temperature ratings. I've forgotten a lot of things in this video, haven't I? Anyways, these MOSFETs are fine all the way up to 150 degrees junction temperature, but you really shouldn't run them that hot, so generally speaking... Wait a minute. I think I found a bug. Give me a second. What? Oh. I'm sitting here like, what? Okay, no. That's why. Yeah. 4.2. Right. No, it's fine. It's fine. I'm sorry for just extending this video like this. I don't know. I must be tired or something. I'll be honest with you. I've not been feeling the best the last few days. It's not been getting enough sleep, and then, like, I spent most of today with a massive headache until I took painkillers. So, yeah. Sorry about sort of flopping through this video like this, but I want to get this one out of the way, because, like, this is a board everybody's interested in. But yeah, these MOSFETs, you can run them up to 125 degrees centigrade with, like, the typical loads. The only issue is your junction, like, the actual silicon inside the MOSFET won't really appreciate that. So for, like, safe operation, which generally junction temperature recommended is, like, around 125 degrees for most MOSFETs, you really wouldn't want to let the VRM go over, let's see, 110 degrees. So, you know, up to 110, it's actually perfectly safe, because the junction won't actually get anywhere near the 150 degree maximum that this VR, like, MOSFETs generally start complaining about. And then the memory VRM right here is a similar situation, though this thing has built-in thermal protection, so if this ever hits 150 degrees centigrade on the junction, it'll actually shut down all on its own. So, yeah. That one will shut down if it overheats, and it'll boot back up once it's below 125 degrees internal temperature again. And yeah, its recommended operating temperature is, again, 125 degrees, though I don't think you have a thermal there's no thermal sensor for that thing, and it really shouldn't be getting very hot under normal running conditions, because, again, it's just powering memory. And if I remember correctly, it should be safe up to, like, 120 or something degrees. Like, it really, because the thing is, it doesn't put out a lot of heat, so if the component gets really, really hot, it's still going to be safe. Actually, let me just pull up the data sheet, because I do have that open. Wrong data sheet. Lucky me. Yeah, it has 6... Yeah, so it has 6 degrees per watt junction to case. So basically, if that thing would need to hit 119 degrees before the internal temperature hits 125 if you're pushing 10 amps through it. So, yeah, this thing, not going to have a problem for up to a very high temperature. Same goes for all the other MOSFETs on the board. So, yeah, decent board. You can run it pretty hot. Not recommended, but you can. Obviously, lower operating temperature extends component lifespan and all that good stuff. It also improves VRM efficiency, but if you're worried about burning the VRM out, you're safe up to like, 100 plus degrees easily on both the memory and the SOC and the Vcore VRM. So if they get a little bit toasty, nothing to worry about. If they get like over 125, that's when I'd start to be concerned. So yeah, that's actually it for this PCB breakdown. I'm sorry, I've just like over time I'm just trying to cram more information, and this one I've managed to also forget a bunch of things throughout. So yeah, and I really don't feel like reshooting it, so deal with it. Anyway, that is it for the video. So don't like it because that was terrible. Leave a comment about how bad it was. What else is there? Any questions or anything like that? Also, just leave comments. And share. Yeah, definitely share the video. Spread the cringe. What else is there? I'm making this worse, aren't I? Subscribe if you haven't already. I should make just like a list. Right, and consider supporting AHOC by donating, buying a shirt, donating the Patreon, PayPal, shirts, Junkyard. Though right now the only thing in the Junkyard is a kit of memory. DDR4 memory, 3400 megahertz rated. You might want to check it out. I'm really trying to get rid of that stuff, so I'm kind of desperate. Because it is just wasting space in like my memory box. Memory drawer. No, it's a box, so memory box. Anyway, what else is there? That's it, right? I haven't forgotten. Oh yeah, there's like an AHOC Facebook and a Twitch and a blog, and you can go check those things out as well. That's it for this video. Sorry for wasting your time so much, and see you next time.